Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 13 of the regular season, the Sharks' first home game of the year between the Sharks and the Golden Knights, in which the Sharks have lost 3-1. And this, at even strength at the very least, was not an awful game for the San Jose Sharks. You could very well argue that this was quite evenly played, and maybe you could even come up with some arguments for why the Sharks were slightly better in this one. But in the end, it is the special teams that get the better of the Sharks, and so they give up 3 power play goals to the Golden Knights to lose this one. First period, the only goal scored would be Jonathan Marchessault to put the Knights up 1-0. Second period would come along. Mark Stone would expand that lead to 2-0 before the Sharks late in the second would get one to cut the lead in half. But in the third period, the only goal scoring would be from the Golden Knights still, with Chandler Stevenson getting yet another power play goal to take the victory for the Golden Knights. Though I will say, compared to how the Sharks looked against the other powerhouse of this division, the Colorado Avalanche, where they got completely crushed 7-3 and then beaten 3-0, this was not an awful game for the Sharks, but in the end, playing decently well will not get you any points in the standings. First thing to talk about would be Martin Jones. He's right back in between the pipes just due to the continued injury of Devan Dubnyk, who I assume once he is healthy will probably at the very least get that nearest start from him returning. And Jones, honestly, a pretty solid game, all things considered. Made a few pretty good saves on the Golden Knights. Didn't really have much of a chance on this Marchessault goal. This Chandler Stevenson goal was pretty lucky bounce for the Golden Knights, all things considered. And with the Mark Stone one, it's just kind of a scramble in front. So Jones, he sort of made the saves he needed to make, and a lot of the blame does have to a bit go to the Sharks' penalty killing here tonight, because Jones, while it wasn't, an amazing game, a perfect game by any means, it was definitely enough to win. But the Sharks just couldn't really back up much with any good defense on the penalty kill or any sort of offense whatsoever besides this one hurdle goal. Next, we'll be talking about Radim Simek. So Simek has been playing the past few games after sitting out the first couple of the year, and he's been doing a pretty solid job. He's seen his ice time scale from the starting, 10 to 11 minutes up to 15, 16 minutes per game, things like that. He started getting played with Erik Karlsson on the second pairing and actually did a pretty decent job at times of really settling Erik Karlsson's game. Karlsson has certainly scaled up a bit in these past few, looking at the very least slightly better than he did early on in the year, where he was a bit of an unmitigated disaster defensively. But here tonight, Simek unfortunately goes down with an injury. He lays a hit onto Riley Smith, then gets a cross-check in the midsection from Jonathan Marchessault with no penalty called, of course, and Simek does not return for the rest of the game, which can be pretty disastrous for the Sharks. Just the other day, I was pointing out how the Sharks' top 6 defense had really solidified with these, clear-cut 6 players, and while it hadn't necessarily been fantastic, at the very least there was no controversy of who was in the lineup from every given night: Burns, Ferraro, Simek, Karlsson, and then Knyzhov and Vlasic. But now, with Simek going down, if he's out for any sort of extended period of time, the Sharks will have to find an actual 6th defenseman to play in this role, and besides Knyzhov, who ended up being a huge surprise in this season, the Sharks don't really have many other options. Middleton is a complete disappointment, and I really would hate to see him back in the lineup because I don't know what anybody else thinks, but I think he's awful. And then Milosh wasn't necessarily anything, amazing in the first game that he played of this season either. So I'm not entirely sure who the Sharks will get into this role. Maybe we'll even see someone who hasn't yet played a game thus far. But that's only, of course, if Simek is out long term. Hopefully that won't end up being the case, because could be pretty bad for the Sharks if it is. Next, I'll be talking about the Sharks' special teams. I mean, it certainly is no secret how bad the Sharks' power play has been, since game 3 or 4 of the regular season, which is kind of strange because the Sharks' power play started off very well right at the start of the year. They seem to be getting a power play goal almost every single game, and the power play was really clicking quite well. But in these past, couple of weeks at this point, 2-3 weeks, it's just kind of been very meh. It did look slightly better against the Los Angeles Kings in the previous game, but here tonight, still basically nothing doing on the power play. But that isn't necessarily what I want to focus on here today. I want to focus more so on the Sharks' penalty kill. The Sharks' penalty kill was number 1 in the NHL last season, and at the start of this year, it was doing similarly as well. But in these past few games, the Sharks have just been having so many holes on their penalty kill. They gave up 3 power play goals tonight on just the 3 goals the Knights scored. They gave up 3 power play goals against the Kings in the previous game, and there was a stat that showed that this is the first time the Sharks have given up 3 power play goals in 2 straight games since 2009, so over 11 years since that last happened. And I believe the Sharks are now, 4 or 5 games in a row having given up at least a single power play goal. It's just been quite bad, and it doesn't even necessarily look like the Sharks have been changing too much in terms of how they're playing structurally on the penalty kill, but it just feels as though they're not getting sticks on these passes. There's been way too many easy cross-ice passes that have been having on opposing teams' power plays. There have been poor coverage in front of the net where it just seems as though every time there's any sort of scramble, any sort of rebound in front, the Sharks are not the first. The Sharks players are not the first ones getting their sticks to clear those pucks away, but instead it is the other team's players who are getting their sticks on those pucks for the easy tap-in goal. That has been a huge issue. And yes, you could also argue that there have been some bad bounces as well, but even with that, or some, I guess, weird situations when it comes to Dustin Brown running into Martin Jones. But even with that, the Sharks' penalty kill absolutely needs to get better. They need to sort out this part of their game, because remember, last season, the only positive for the Sharks in that year was the fact that their penalty kill was first in the NHL. So if they can't even have that this year, then what do they actually have going for them? And then finally, I will talk about Bob Booner, the coach of the San Jose Sharks. I rarely, if ever, mention what the coach is doing. I'll occasionally say, I don't know why this player was benched for this player. But I have been really finding myself questioning a lot of Booner's choices with the lineup in the past couple of weeks, honestly. I mean, let's just first start off with things outside of the game, which I'll say Chmelevski. Chmelevski comes in this game against the Anaheim Ducks. He has a very solid first shift where he ends up with a good chance on net. He gets his first NHL assist. Things seem to be going well, and yet Chmelevski was given 6 minutes that night in terms of ice time, and then hasn't yet seen back in the Sharks lineup since then. Meanwhile, Rudolph Balcers steps into the lineup for this next game against the Anaheim Ducks. He's more invisible than Chmelevski was offensively, yet with almost double the ice time. And what ends up with Balcers? He actually ends up in the lineup for another straight game, still ends up with a couple minutes more than what Chmelevski had in his sole appearance. And then, while he was benched for the following one, he comes right back into the lineup here tonight and is on the second line. Looks marginally better, though you could definitely explain that away with the fact that he's been playing here with Hertl and Meyer for this game. He does get a point, but it's just kind of questionable to me that Chmelevski, he ends up having a very solid first game. I thought he had a pretty good debut and yet hasn't drawn back into the lineup since then. Meanwhile, Rudolph Balcers, with 2 games under his belt of doing very, very little, somehow finds his way onto the second line for this one. Just kind of questionable to me. It's nothing to say bad about Balcers, but I just felt as though it's a bit of a weird choice. And another one, Noah Gregor, I thought has had a very solid season thus far. Yes, maybe he hasn't been super effective in the past couple of games that the Sharks have played against the Kings, maybe even going back to the Ducks. But has he really been so bad that he gets benched here in favor of Curtis Gabriel, who, if you had told me this guy did not play tonight and the Sharks dressed 11 forwards, I would absolutely believe you with how invisible he was here on the ice. It just kind of seems like another strange choice where you're kind of benching a player for the sake of change, even though Gregor has been pretty decent and Gabriel has shown basically nothing. I mean, obviously I can't really say that. Maybe at practice he's like incredibly impressive, like the Connor McDavid of practice. But there certainly wasn't anything that, he showed on the ice that would make me think that was the case. And so just these lineup decisions have been kind of strange. And I should also mention, when it comes to the ice time as well, it has been some strange choices. Now, this could potentially be something to do with Erik Karlsson being injured at some point in this game, so I will apologize if that is the case. But Erik Karlsson did not play the latter half of this third period. And I know Booner has mentioned in the media that he's, manipulating ice time in such a way that the players who he feels deserves the extra ice time will get it, and the players who he feels do not deserve the extra ice time will not get it. So for instance, some games where Meier hasn't been necessarily all that effective, he's been given only like 13 minutes on a specific night. So this could have potentially happened here tonight with Erik Karlsson. And I will say this. I feel as though Booner does not really have the luxury of making choices like that. To me, the only two situations where coaches have the luxury of making those types of choices are when in situation one, where you're a coach of a really, really strong team with a ton of depth, like let's say you're John Cooper of the Tampa Bay Lightning. And so if Brayden Point, let's say, is not having a good game, you could say, oh, I'll play him 3-4 less minutes because my team is so strong that we probably have a very good chance of winning this night anyway. And the other situation is if you're, let's say, DJ Smith of the Ottawa Senators, where you're clearly a rebuilding team and you're not necessarily pushing for wins, and you're more so setting in part just a strong system that can eventually get you wins within the next couple of years. You're at that point, you can take your star player, let's say Brady Tkachuk, and say, okay, he's not having a good game, let me bench him for 4 or 5 minutes because we probably aren't going to be winning this game anyway. We're probably not going to be winning too many games this season anyway, so let me just sort of send a message here. From my perspective, the Sharks are very clearly not a Tampa Bay Lightning style team, and I don't think they are yet an Ottawa Senators type of team. So if the Sharks are trying to scratch and claw for as many possible points as they can get, I feel as though you do not have the luxury, if you're Bob Booner, of just benching really good players in favor of playing like Rudolph Balcers for extra minutes or Dylan Gambrell for extra minutes. I mean, I've praised Gambrell this season for, coming into his own as a third-line center two-way style, but he hasn't really done much of anything at all this season offensively. So the fact that Gambrell is getting like 6 minutes more per night at times than players like Donato and Meier, and this is like consistently happening, is not necessarily a great choice in my opinion. But anyway, just having gotten that out of the way, that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action in just a couple of days. On Monday, will they face off against the Anaheim Ducks yet again at home, and we'll see if the Sharks can get back into the win column. Class dismissed.